Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Dalbor Rohach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. As always, I'm joined by Julia Joja, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and teaching international relations, European security and other subjects at Georgetown and George Washington universities. Our special guest today is Stefan Meister, who heads a program on order and security in Eastern Europe and Eurasia at the German Council on Foreign Relations, which is Germany's leading foreign policy think tank. On our podcast, we discuss security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Let us now start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. So there have been a number of elections taking place. Not all of them have been concluded quite yet. So Moldova has its second round this coming weekend, but there have been a few in Bulgaria, Lithuania and Georgia that I think are sort of worth spending a little bit of time on. So Julia, why don't you tell us first a little bit about Bulgaria and the significance of the vote there?
Indeed, we're in full swing of the election season, not just in the United States, but in Europe and on the Eastern Front. And Bulgaria is an interesting case. They've had elections the past Sunday, the 27th, and it's the, I believe, sixth election in 3 or 4 years. It all started with massive anti-corruption protests in 2020 that toppled the government led by the head of the center-right party GERB, Borisov by name. That's how it started. And ever since, we've had basically a spiraled deadlock with snap elections taking place every few months and very low voting participation. So now we're at round 6, I believe, and the elections haven't led to major change, just like the previous ones. The biggest chunk of votes was taken by, but not enough for a majority, was taken by the same Borisov that was leading the government that fell 4 years ago with the anti-corruption. He does not, and the party do not have a majority, and they've already announced that they will decide on what the coalition looks like depending on the outcome of the US elections. Also quite unprecedented in the region. We're now taking decisions at the EU level and at the national level based on the outcome of the elections in the United States. But the one big change in Bulgaria that is sort of creeping in and is creeping in across the region is the rise of the far right in response to rising costs of living in the region, Russia's propaganda and disinformation in the region, and of course government incompetence at the regional level. And so we have the far right, very openly pro-Russian party in Bulgaria coming in third, but with a significant increase and very close, less than 1% behind the pro-Western reformist bloc. So one came at, the elections are not finalized in terms of counting. We're at like 98% of the ballots, the latest results, but it looks like it's going to be less than 1% of a difference between the reformist pro-Western bloc of parties and the far right coming in. And if we couple that with the announcement of the winners, the GERB party and Borisov, that they won't be creating a coalition until US elections, we can almost anticipate that a possible win by Trump will lead to the rise of the far right coming into power in Bulgaria. And then just quickly to connect it to kind of bigger regional trends, we'll talk about Hungary unequivocally in a second because we can't talk around it in the context of Georgia. But we have elections in Romania coming up too, presidential and legislative, in the next coming weeks, end of November, beginning of December. And there too, it looks like the far right is on the rise and could come in even second, which is more of a complicated political calculation. And we'll talk about that more as we get closer to those elections. But we overall see in the region the rise of the far right, enabled partially by the economic situation in the war, enabled partially by Russia, but also increasingly enabled by possible election results in the United States. Quite scary.
This is fascinating that they would say that they'll wait for Trump to be elected or not to see what sort of coalition they want to form. So one thing, I don't know anything about Bulgaria, but one thing I do know about Boyko Borisov is that he started his career as the protection officer, bodyguard to the last communist leader of Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov, and then he, looks the part, certainly.
Yeah, and that too connects also region-wide with Serbia, where we have for a long time now the leader in Serbia being the ex-head of propaganda ministry during Milosevic. So this is all the old guard turning new guard, turning old guard again. Very much in parallel to Putin's evolution in Russia, isn't it?
Yeah, and we can sort of talk about like Trump's mental world being kind of firmly in place in the late 1970s and not really evolving much since. But that's another story. So the other big election that we obviously care about is the one that took place in Georgia on Saturday. Everybody has seen the news. Georgian Dream claims victory in a ballot that was neither free nor fair by, according to most observers, widespread election fraud, carousel schemes, all kinds of sort of shenanigans to ramp up the Georgian Dream vote. People are having, legitimate questions about whether it is all due to just fraud or whether much of the support for Georgian Dream was genuine. Like whether you can sort of account for the election result just by sort of pointing out to the instances of fraud. And there are some, statistical work that has been done on the sort of distribution of votes across districts. And so clearly there was manipulation going on. But there is a sort of separate story to be told about, the opposition not really being able to unite and having, zillion different parties that only formed 4 blocks before the elections, didn't really campaign as well as they could have. So I'm hearing both of these sort of narratives from my Georgian friends. Yes, there has been fraud and this election should not be recognized by anybody as legitimate and there should be a new election. But at the same time, this might have been an opportunity for the opposition and the opposition largely, which all of this makes me very pessimistic about Georgia, because it's unlikely that the opposition and the sort of civil society at large will get a second chance anytime soon. So the president called for protests and there have been some protests, but it's unlikely that you would have a sort of persistent Maidan-like wave of protests that would lead to anything. They already did that in the aftermath of the adoption of the Russian-style foreign agents law to no avail, and now it looks like they have very little international backing. So when you look at the sort of statements from people like Borrell and Blinken, it's all very weak tea, and there is no sense that there'll be sort of follow through with sanctions or other coercive measures, or the only Western leader who came to Tbilisi was Viktor Orban, and it wasn't with a message for the people protesting. It wasn't to encourage them. It was to lend legitimacy to what was a fraudulent result. So my take is we are again, as many times before, just asleep at the wheel on autopilot. Nobody wants to deal with this situation anymore. Week to the election in the US, and we are basically handing over Georgia on a plate to Putin.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to it. So I've seen Viktor Orban being met with protests in Georgia, which was a nice thing to see, but we can only imagine how disappointing it must be for the Georgian protesters to see that all they get from us, the West, is Viktor Orban. The one response that I've seen is a letter signed by 13 ministers from EU countries questioning the election results. And here a shout out really to the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, for saying out loud, not just calling for protests, but saying she will not recognize the election. The election is a fraud. That is quite a courageous movement of hers. She's been inching towards that, but she certainly didn't have to do that. It's a symbolic move, and you would think that it would push the West, both EU and US leaders, to do more. I remember vaguely from 2008 how the leaders of the Baltic countries, Poland, showed up in Tbilisi. No one stops any EU leaders to show up today in Tbilisi. And yet, everything that the Georgians are getting, despite showing up last night on the 28th in significant numbers and in a very impressive response to the call for protest from the president, despite that, the answer is lukewarm, to say the least. All we do is a statement. And by the way, among the 13 countries countries that have signed the statement is not Romania, that wants itself to be the leader of the West in the Black Sea region. So there's Portugal, but there isn't Romania. How ridiculous is that? And in combined with Viktor Orban's presence, it just shows that the West has no teeth and is completely divided. We're basically exactly where Putin wants us to be on Georgia, in my opinion.
Also, on that letter, and we can link to it in the show notes. So it's not exactly foreign ministers, right, with some exceptions. So for most of the big countries, it's kind of like European affairs ministers, which typically would be sort of junior role at the foreign ministry. So it hasn't even been sort of like escalated to that level at which, the sort of bigger players of European politics would have to like engage with it. And I can imagine why even the sort of most supportive people in Europe, the sort of Landsbergis of Lithuania and others, they might be reluctant to go to Tbilisi because they really have very little that will be sort of tangible that they could offer right now. And so I think that makes the situation different from 2014 in Ukraine, from the Rose Revolution. And it's almost as if the collective West was just like, hoping like for this to go away. Like, let's throw Georgia under the bus and just forget about it.
Yeah, frankly, we haven't decided in the EU whether Georgia is Europe or not. We still haven't decided after 2014, 2008, 2022. We still haven't decided. And that's the clear message, exactly, because they could follow up if they wanted to through sanctions, through other measures. We certainly have the instruments. But the truth is, we've not decided that they're part of us, even though they're more European than many of us. Yeah.
Just the one final little tidbit on Georgia. So the president, very courageous. She's now the sort of main driver of the sort of protest movement, which I'm afraid is going nowhere. But the trouble is that her mandate expires soon. So even if she kind of is completely obstructionist, says, I'm not going to engage with Georgian Dream, I'm going to appoint new prime minister, I'm not going to do anything, they can just wait her out. And they changed the way presidents are elected in Georgia. So she's the last directly, popularly elected president. And there'll be a college of electors appointed by the new legislature that will elect her successor. And so that will be a Georgian Dream guy or lady. But in any way, it looks like there is sort of one-way street towards entrenchment by Georgian Dream and by extension by Russia. That's going to happen in Georgia, and there is very little that is going to be done about it. So that to me, speaks to this broader pattern of just like Western retreat from the world, including from South Caucasus and having the Armenian prime minister, right? Like the guy who was kind of toying with the idea of forging deeper ties with Europe in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion, be among the first ones to congratulate Georgian Dream, I think tells you just how much the world has changed after 2022. That we sort of assume that, this war is such a blunder, Putin is going to fail and bear the cost in terms of lesser influence in the region. The opposite has happened. You had the Kazan summit with the obsequious Secretary General of the UN, hugging Lukashenko and other mass murderers. So going to China this week, you have obviously Orban kind of flexing his muscles or body fat or whatever he's flexing in Tbilisi. It's a picture of Western fecklessness, retreat. It's not good.
It's a picture of the West losing and being fine with it. That's what it is. Audience here has heard it before, but every time you and I go to the region, the summer, the fall, people are telling us, well, the establishment is convinced that the West is losing in Georgia, in Turkey, even in Armenia, all across the region. And so Viktor Orban and Trump and all the rest are just underlining it. We're losing and we're fine with that because it's none of our business and we want to go back to business with Putin.
I suppose the question is, before we close this segment, whether there is any hope for things to get better after November 5th in the United States. And I don't think I have a terribly uplifting answer to that because it looks like what Vice President Harris is offering is a continuation of the current path. I hope that path will be kind of changed by the sheer force of events, that people will have to be forced to step up. And I think that Vice President Harris would be better positioned to lead that change than her opponent. But if her opponent is elected, then I see, not only the continuation of the current trend, but their acceleration. And somebody like Trump, happily handing over Eastern Europe to Putin, happily turning his back on NATO collective security arrangements and, retreating from the world like, Lindbergh would have it.
Yeah, I just gave a few minutes ago an interview to a French publication and I concluded with around the same questions, I concluded with Trump does not care about European security and Harris cares somewhat. So this is what we have to look towards in the next few months and hope exactly that if Harris wins, the events will push her to be maybe a little bit more resolute than Biden was.
Let us now turn to our second segment. Our special guest is Dr. Stefan Meister, who's the head of the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia and Central Asia at the DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Affairs. Stefan, great to have you on the show. You are joining us from Samarkand in Uzbekistan, which is very exciting. I wanted to start this conversation by bring up one thought I heard recently from the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee here in the United States, Mike Turner, who suggested at an AEI event that since Russia is so preoccupied with its war effort in Ukraine, it can create an opportunity for both the EU and the United States and the collective West at large to, try pulling different threats in Central Asia, in the Black Sea region, in sort of countries that are not in the center of the Kremlin's sharp focus right now, that there's only so much bandwidth that Vladimir Putin has, and that we really should be sort of seizing this opportunity, whether it's Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Black Sea region, or further east, maybe in countries such as Uzbekistan, where you find yourself. Now, you've written a report for DGAP on Central Asia, EU cooperation. You've written extensively on this subject. What do you think are kind of the most obvious opportunities that Europeans in particular should be seizing in this context?
First of all, thank you for having me for this. Yeah, I think first of all we have to understand the weaker Russia becomes, the more disruptive it is also as an actor. That does not mean that if Russia is weakened, it is weak, and it is even more active now also in some regions, including the South Caucasus and also Central Asia. We have seen how Russia has impacted on the Moldovan elections just recently, on the referendum and on the presidential elections, in which scale they really impacted and also invested into manipulating this election. So I think we should be careful in saying that Russia is weak at the moment. It is weakened. It is distracted by its war in Ukraine. It's pulling a lot of resources into Ukraine, also military resources. So it's on all its borders somehow weakened. So yeah, but still I think it's very disruptive and it's very active also in the Black Sea, in the South Caucasus and beyond. But I agree, I think there's a window open at the moment that Russia has to put more resources into Ukraine. And I think Russia has lost its role as a regional hegemon, for instance, in the South Caucasus, but also in other post-Soviet regions. It cannot provide authoritarian stability anymore in these regions, and it has to bargain also with other actors in these regions. Yeah, and I think that is an opportunity also for the EU and maybe also the US to be more active. And the EU has started to do this, with offering membership perspective for Ukraine, for Moldova, for Georgia, increasing also its connectivity policy. It also tries to export increasingly its norms and standards through different kinds of connectivity. But it needs to underline this also through political ownership, through more strategic approach, bringing these countries closer to Europe, even maybe without integrating or full-fledged integrating these countries into the EU, but to be more present there, politically more present, economically more present with its norms and standards, and to challenge Russia also as the main actor in the South Caucasus, in the Black Sea region, and really to develop more strategic approach, a more long-term approach also for the countries, and not just as a bridge to Asia, but also investing in the countries and in the infrastructure also to Asia. And I think here the EU can do much more than it is doing at the moment, and it needs to go beyond also all this rhetoric we have on connectivity and so on.
I want to pick up right there, because what you're telling me with economic investments is something that I've seen, and I know you've seen much more extensively than I have, particularly in the South Caucasus that I know you're focused on, but across the region. It's when you ask people about EU sentiments, etc., and Western sentiments, they say, yeah, it can be good, can be bad. But the problem is the economic footprint is lacking, even though the European Union, more so than the United States, has a more direct interest. And I know you've been sort of tasked by the European Union to contribute and think about a Black Sea strategy for the European Union. So would you lay out, I know this is the very early days, but would you lay out what you think the EU should be prioritizing. You just mentioned membership opportunities that we have tabled for the first time in a long time after we've had enlargement fatigue, right? But it is also about connectivity, economic investments, political strategy, etc. So where do you think, before maybe you go into the details of where we're actually at overall, but where do you think the strategy should be leading towards, and what do you think it should be focused on?
I think, first of all, the question is, what does connectivity really means? Yeah, so I think it has become a buzzword, and everything now is connectivity. Like it was in the past resilience, it's now all about connectivity. But I think it's not really defined, and it's not really underlined also by really serious money. Yeah, in a way, by serious investment. And everybody asks, so what is this investment now really about? And we also understand it's huge infrastructure investment is needed. And the question is, will this pay back also on one point? But I think, and this is maybe a bit a challenge also with Brussels, everything is securitized now. Everything is about security, and it's also about strategic infrastructure. It's about ports, security also of this kind of infrastructure, of cables. It's about internet connectivity, for instance. So I think there are different kinds of connectivity in which on one hand it needs investment, but on the other hand, it also we need to think about how to secure this kind of connectivity and infrastructure. It's also about human security. Yeah, it's about socioeconomic developments in a way. And then we are back to resilience. Yeah, also in this wider Black Sea region, it's about dealing with conflicts in the region. So I think that's all not defined in my opinion. So we're talking now about hard infrastructure. Yeah, we talk about trade, but how this is also influenced by the war and maybe by a long war in Ukraine, by a Russia, which also is a key security actor in the Black Sea region, which has built up a huge amount of military equipment and military after the annexation of Crimea and then also in the years afterwards. I think the question, first of all, is who can provide security in the Black Sea region? Is it maybe more NATO if you talk about hard security? And then it's about how to improve connectivity for Ukraine, but also beyond Ukraine into the South Caucasus, between Caspian Sea and Black Sea, and then to Central Asia and further Asia. And how to provide with this investment in strategic infrastructure or in these connections, if it's railway, if it's port infrastructure, if it's highways, where to get the investment from, but also how to be sure that the European norms and standards are also provided there. And then also impacts on the reforms, on the situation in the countries, on the road, you can say so. And I think this is maybe more important than the connection between Asia and Europe, but really how the EU can project or can change its role in the Black Sea region to invest in infrastructure, to bring these norms and standards, and then to connect and then invest also in the South Caucasus and around the Caspian Sea, further to Central Asia, into these countries. I don't see this at the moment yet. So I think this is maybe the problem of the EU. The main thing is enlargement again. Yeah. And I think looking to the Western Balkans, enlargement somehow failed. So the question is when it will come, how long it will take. And then maybe it needs something else. And as I said, it's connectivity, but this is not underlined with a consistent policy. And I rather see competition between different agencies and actors inside of the EU and also with the member states than really a full-fledged strategy.
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is that what you're telling us sounds to me like a sort of recognition of what might be one feature of sort of the EU, which is kind of rules-oriented bureaucratic approach to things. When Global Gateway was set up, it was this sort of nebulous effort to compete with China's Belt and Road, but without much of a geographic focus and built around this buzzword of connectivity. And obviously, connectivity is good. We want more connectivity, but there was no sense of sort of strategic direction or regions that we would sort of consider as key or important. And now, obviously, in the aftermath of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the new commission, kind of security considerations were sort of added on top of that without really changing the fundamental framework, though, that we still kind of don't know what the sort of geographic focus is and what the sort of projects that we would prioritize look like. And obviously that sort of abstract lingo of connectivity, etc., doesn't really provide guidance. So feel free to sort of disagree with me on that if you will. And here's the question. So assuming that there are opportunities to sort of do things, including through Global Gateway and other frameworks with countries of Central Asia, where do the structural differences between Western democracies and the EU EU and those countries with their own forms of governance and, invariably autocratic forms of governance and absence of rule of law. How does that sort of come into play? And how is that going to sort of shape cooperation and some of these joint connectivity focused projects going forward? Because it strikes me that many of these countries are in a very different position from Ukraine or Moldova that kind of aspire at becoming like the West. I mean, the Uzbekistans or Kazakhstan don't necessarily aspire at becoming part of the EU or look like the EU.
No, I agree with you. I think it's merely a reaction by the bureaucracy to a new reality. And then the member states decided, okay, because of Ukraine, we offer now, we open the membership package again. I think there is an opportunity to finally end this approach of the EU to have for each region its own policy without connecting regions, without connecting the dots. I think this is where, for me, connectivity makes sense. And Russia, China, Turkey, they connect regions. They don't think in bargain, but they think also in bigger regions, in mega regions. And the Black Sea, is a region to project power beyond the Black Sea, also for Russia and Turkey, for instance. So the whole Syria campaign of Russia was done from the Black Sea in a way, from Crimea, and that was a crucial step. So, and I think this for the EU, it's really an opportunity to think beyond just the South Caucasus, just the Black Sea, but to connect them. The problem is it's driven by the bureaucracy at the moment. It's not driven really by the member states. You maybe have Romania, which has its interests in the Black Sea and is really pushing for a different security approach, and also in the economic sector and trade and so on. But I don't see that the big member states are really picking up this topic and driving it. So it's given to the bureaucracy, and that makes it relatively weak and bureaucratic in a way. And nobody wants to touch in the end the security topic, and then you end up with these buzzwords. So I think this is a bit the problem I see at the moment, and I don't see that we are really overcoming this for the foreseeable future. Even there's not a more critical mass of member states and also bigger member states who picking up this importance of the Black Sea. So that's my first point. Coming to your question on EU and the West versus maybe also these more authoritarian countries or transition countries still in a way in terms of their governance systems. I think the competition in the end is between the EU norms and standards, Chinese norms and standards in a way, also in some sectors, Russian norms and standards. Russia is also a successful norm setter. If we look into control of civil society, if we look into foreign agent laws, for instance, or also internet control. And I think here I see rather the competition. And I think the EU has maybe better chances to promote or to get a resonance also for its norms and standards in this wider Black Sea region, in the South Caucasus, than in Central Asia, where it's no direct neighbor, where China and Russia are really dominating. Arab countries are really dominating, and the EU has also not the ambitions to be really a relevant actor. I think I hope at least, that's different in the South Caucasus. This is different in the Black Sea region because it's direct neighborhood, and it's crucial also for the EU, to have here its norms and standards implemented. And there's also maybe more society exchange also with these countries, which can help to do so. But I think we are really in a very dynamic situation. We are really in the competition with other players. And if the EU does not come up with more political ownership, with more also presence of EU member states, leaders in these countries, and pushing also EU policy in the different sectors we started to discuss, the EU will not win this competition. And we see this situation in Moldova. We have soon also the election in Georgia. Armenia is a very fragile country. So these problems with Azerbaijan at the moment, you need really more political ownership. And that's I think, for my opinion, crucial.
Stefan, this is very interesting, and I want to pick up on one of the two things that you mentioned, and that is the level of ambition combined with bigger member states or their absence. You mentioned that, and for those of us following the EU, we know that there's even these jokes, but they're connected to reality, that if you don't have Germany and ideally France, either one of them or the two of them on board, it's very hard to push things through just because of how the EU works. And I know you've been working with the Germans as well, that they are thinking at the governmental level about more Black Sea or East policy. So can you tell us what Germany's vision is when it comes to Black Sea, South Caucasus, and into Central Asia, whether it is just about trade, whether there is some dimension of competition with Russia and or China, and what you think, what you can interpret the priorities priorities are, what could possibly be Germany's footprint or leverage in this regional policy that it is my feeling the EU also is trying to design. And I want to connect this to, was it 2 weeks ago, somewhat recently, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz went to Kazakhstan to talk about labor markets and to talk about migration and to talk about interconnectivity. And he wasn't the first EU leader to show up in the region. So how should we understand, is there a drive from Germany to lead on this? How do you evaluate that? And what are Germany's priorities when they're looking at this space? How could Germany be shifting or co-designing this regional policy of the European Union?
So we talk about German Zeitenwende and if it really works and how it impacts on the Eastern policy of the EU. I think we have to understand with this big war of Russia against Ukraine since 2022, we see a failure of German Ostpolitik. So I think this is really not only the end of the European security order as we know it, the Cold War, but it's also the bankruptcy of Germany's Russia and Eastern Europe policy of the past 30 years. Yeah, because it failed with Russia, we can say, with its appeasement policy towards Russia. And there is a different perception of Russia. And I would even say there is maybe an Ukraine first policy in a way. So it was Russia first. Now it's maybe more Ukraine first. The challenge for Germany is it has not only to redefine its business model now without cheap Russian gas, but also its role in Europe it wants to play. And if it's really willing and able to take a leadership role in European foreign and security policy and then also in the Eastern Europe policy. And this has not yet been decided. We don't have yet really a serious discussion about this future role of Germany in EU's foreign policy and also in the Eastern Europe policy of the EU. And what we see with this war is also lack of German leadership. Yeah, I think we don't see that Germany is really leading Europe on this war of Russia against Ukraine and on how to deal with Russia. There is more German support now, but I don't really see a strategic approach. So, and I think this is also due to this current government coalition we have and the chancellor who is, how to say, he's not a born leader, yeah, or he's maybe also very, very careful in leading on anything, or he's risk averse, I would even say. But it's also very dysfunctional policy. So even if we now discussing in Berlin, so how this new Russia policy could look like, Ukraine policy, it's mainly business driven, yeah, at the moment. So we need to replace Russian gas. We need alternative also to different kind of resources to Russia. And there Central Asia comes in. And the current Chancellor Scholz, he is very much business-driven guy. So he travels to Central Asia for 2 days, not only to deploy Afghan migrants via Uzbekistan to Afghanistan back, and maybe get also some labor force from Central Asian countries, but really to make also business deals on gas, on oil, and also on other kind of resources. But this is not underlined by a strategic approach, unfortunately. And there's a lack of a vision, I would even say. It's very much crisis-driven approach and really a kind of a transactional approach. Yeah. So, and it's even not coordinated with the EU. It's not coordinated with France. Macron was also in Central Asia. Yeah. So, and I think that's the problem. I don't see at the moment Germany really as a driving force here, as a leader who, like in the past, tries to consolidate a European policy towards this region. I think unfortunately this is the case at the moment.
Stefan, thank you so much for this education on a understudied and in some ways underrated region of the world that should be, I think, much higher on the list of priorities of European and US leaders. And we hope to have you back on the podcast soon.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
Let us now turn to our third segment. My understanding, Yuda, is that you have a recommendation for our listeners, so please fire away.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep it short. This time it is a report issued by KSE, and we'll link to it, KSE Institute from Ukraine. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's called Creating Shadow-Free Zones, Proposal for the Implementation of an Insurance Requirement to Address Key Environmental Risks. That's a mouthful, but what the report is actually about is what we here call ghost fleets. So Russia's ghost fleet specifically in the Baltic and the environmental risks that come with it. I've been following this topic very closely in connection to Russia, but also in connection to Iran, these ghost fleets, because now it's really plural in terms of both countries and regions, are in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, in the Mediterranean, all the time on their way to China and out of China. And we've had bits and pieces kind of at the global level looking at or in inching towards looking at the environmental risks, not just the security risks, or rather the environmental security risks that come with it. Think all oil spills, think these ships should not be operating, think of enormous environmental costs and economic costs when, because it's not a matter of if, but rather when things go south, and this could happen in any region. This is the first report that actually dedicates space and time to looking into the risks, the costs, and the consequences and implications specific to the Baltic region, a region that is a lot more controlled by the West, right? We were joking about NATO making it a NATO lake once Sweden and Finland joined NATO. So in this rather secure environment, they're looking at options of how these risks can be mitigated with concrete proposals. To me, this is even more relevant to other regions, but they're the first ones who are putting some energy into this. So that's my recommendation for this week.
Great. With that, thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast on security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics you'd like us to cover. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider rating, subscribing, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and goodbye.